I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. The world we live in, a world that some have called post-Christian, has what today's podcast guest Paul Gould calls a disenchanted view of reality. He believes that materialism and scientism, among other influences, have left us with a way of seeing, thinking, and living that leaves no space for beauty or wonder. We now live in a world bereft of mystery. Gould says many Christians have uncritically accepted this materialistic understanding of the world, and as a result, the Christian imagination, conscience, and voice in the culture have become distorted or muted. Paul Gould's new book, Cultural Apologetics, addresses these issues by setting forth a fresh model for cultural engagement, rooted in the biblical account of Paul's speech on Mars Hill, which details practical steps for reestablishing the Christian voice and conscience and imagination. Paul Gould received his Ph.D. from Purdue University and is currently a Henry Fellow at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He also teaches philosophy and apologetics in the College of Graduate and Professional Studies at Oklahoma Baptist University. In addition to the book we're going to spend most of our time with today, Cultural Apologetics, he's also the co-author of Philosophy, a Christian Introduction to the Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Proclaim the Glory of God. The Colson Center's Warren Cole Smith had this conversation with Paul Gould at Summit Ministries in Manitou Springs, Colorado, at a youth conference where they both were regular speakers. Here are Warren Cole Smith and Paul Gould.
Paul, welcome to the program. I've just got to tell you, I'm a big fan of your book, Cultural Apologetics, and I'd like to start our conversation with that book. First of all, can you define cultural apologetics? I think a lot of our listeners might be familiar with the word apologetics, but what do you mean when you say cultural apologetics?
Okay, yeah. Great. Thank you. It's great to be here, Warren. So cultural apologetics, it's interesting. About 5 years ago at the seminary I was teaching at, I was asked to teach this course called Cultural Apologetics. And so I did what any educator would do at the time. I'm a philosopher primarily, and I do a lot in the area of apologetics. So I Googled the phrase cultural apologetics because I had that very same question you did. And, I found very little at the time. There were some people that had, mentioned that phrase, but there was really very little there. So what I did for the next 5 years, every time I taught that class, I would assign 7 books on culture and the gospel and apologetics. And then, work those out in 7 different ones. And over the course of about 5 years of teaching, I finally came up with my own definition. So here's my own view of what cultural apologetics is. It's basically this: working to establish the Christian voice, conscience, and imagination so that the gospel will be viewed as reasonable and desirable. So in other words, as a cultural apologist, we're concerned with how the gospel is being perceived and how it's being heard, or actually even if it is getting a hearing in our culture. So we care about how ideas work in culture, and we care about the culture-shaping institutions of the world, and we care about how the gospel is being perceived at the level of individual lives. And so that's what we're doing in cultural apologetics.
Now, some folks might be familiar with the word or the phrase pre-evangelism. Yeah. Is there any relationship between that, which I think may come from folks like Francis Schaeffer, and what you're talking about, or are you really talking about something completely different?
No, I think pre-evangelism could be helpful. It's more than pre-evangelism. So the idea is the big, and to even drill down a little bit more, part of what the task of the cultural apologist is to understand the culture we find ourselves in, identify starting points, kind of like Paul did in Acts chapter 17, and then build a bridge from our culture to the gospel, responding to objections along the way. And so it's more than pre-evangelism. It's interesting, in some ways, this is basically how I view apologetics, that the gospel's never proclaimed in a vacuum, right? There's a collective mindset of our culture, there's a collective conscience of our culture, there's a collective imagination of our culture, and all of that informs whether or not people will even view the gospel as plausible or implausible, desirable or undesirable. So yes, pre-evangelism is part of it because we care about the soil for, where the seed is sown, but of course it's more than that. It's how do we build a bridge from the culture we find ourselves in to Jesus and the gospel as well.
You said something, Paul, in that answer that I want to ask you to say more about, and that is the idea of whether the gospel is plausible or implausible in a culture. That notion of plausibility is one that has been explored a good bit by philosophers, and one that you take up as well in your book, right?
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we ask and consider, these questions. How is the gospel, or how is Christianity in general, viewed by those in culture? If I walk into a university campus today and I want to have an outreach about the Flat Earth Society, and so I put up, banners everywhere. Come hear what the Flat Earth Society has to say about the world. My guess is many people, they're not going to be too interested in that because they don't take that as a serious idea. And the idea is the same thing for many today. If we want to have an outreach on a college campus, come hear what Jesus has to say about the nature of the world. Well, it kind of sounds the same as it sounded to us when I talked about the flat earth. And so as philosophers, actually just as when we think of missions and things like that, we want to pay attention to the conditions of the soil, to switch, back to the parable of Jesus here, so that, the gospel will actually get a fair hearing. And so that's the idea of a plausibility structure.
Well, you mentioned the word missions, and that also calls to mind another important figure and sort of set of ideas around this figure in your book and in your work, and that is the missionary Lesslie Newbigin. Would you say a few words about him and why he's important to you personally and his role in helping you understand some of the ideas that you're talking about?
Yeah. I actually found his work really helpful in thinking about the project of cultural apologetics today in the 21st century. And the reason is, so Lesslie Newbigin, as a young man in 1936, he was sent from Great Britain to minister to the Hindus in India. And he faithfully ministered there for almost 40 years. He comes back to his original sending country, Great Britain, in 1974, only to find out, as he would put it, in the time that he was away, the whole country had become post-Christian, is how he described it. And so he began to realize that he needed to have a missionary encounter with his own culture. And he explored that in a book that he wrote in the late 70s called The Foolishness to the Greeks. And there's a question that he asks on the very first page of that book that's the crucial question of our day and age. You can even call it Newbigin's question. Basically, it's this. What would be involved, he asks, in a genuine missionary encounter between the gospel and the whole way of thinking, perceiving, and living that we call modern Western society? And so again, I think that he just understood that the gospel's never proclaimed in a vacuum. And so I have been following his steps in trying to understand our culture and then build a bridge like he did as well.
So given that, what are some of the implications of that idea of being sort of a missionary to your homeland, a missionary in a post-Christian culture, as Newbigin identified maybe first that we needed to be, and you are picking up the mantle of that? What are the implications of that?
Well, the implication is the more that we begin to look at our culture today, the more that we understand our culture, which again I think is, what the first step of a cultural apologist, we learn that things, the way that I like to say it, that this is not a business as usual time for the church. Sociologists have noted that the culture that we find ourselves in today, especially in the West, is unprecedented in all of history in the sense that prior to the way that the West has evolved today, most cultures thought there's a tight connection between the sacred order and the natural or social order. But in our culture, there's been a severing of this tight connection between the sacred order and the social order. And so pretty much anything goes. And so so one of the words that I use in the book is that the dominant way of perceiving in our culture is that of disenchantment. And what I mean by that is that we no longer see the world in its proper light. And of course, if we don't see the world, and this actually affects Christians just as much as non-believers, if we don't see the world the way Jesus does and delight in it the way that Jesus does, well, that's going to affect the way that we live in the world and act in the world. And so part of the project is that we need to re-enchant ourselves and begin to see the world the way Jesus does and delight in it the way Jesus does, and then go and invite others to do likewise.
Well, that word enchantment, disenchantment is full of meaning. In some ways there's a double entendre there, right? That when we are enchanted with something, there's a connection to that thing that is beyond reason, right? That we're responding not just to, say, the truth of an idea, but to the beauty of that idea as well. And when we are disenchanted, there's a connotation of that, of being discouraged. It's not just it's failing to be enchanted by an idea, but in some ways we're also discouraged by that lack of enchantment. Are you meaning all of that whenever you are talking about that word?
Yeah, it's an interesting word. It was originally coined by Max Weber, where he was noticing that the world is being emptied of her magic. And, if you think of the ancient experience of the world, think of the Greeks or the Romans, and it was a world that was populated with gods and goddesses and nymphs and dryads, and you never knew if you were going to come into the presence of something divine. And so the experience of the world was one of mystery, and vulnerability. You can't buffer yourself from that kind of a world. But if you contrast that with the current modern experience of the world, the disenchanted experience of the world, it's a very flat experience of the world. world, and nothing's beyond the mundane. There's no deep meaning to the world. We exist in this cosmic, this little planet in the middle of a mediocre galaxy, in the middle of a vast, 100 billion galaxies of 100 billion stars and things like that. There's no meaning, no purpose, no nothing, and we're just kind of sailing along in a vast sea of nothingness, as Nietzsche would put it. And so the modern view of the world is quite discouraging and quite boring, frankly, because it says there's nothing special about you, there's nothing special about the world around us, and so on. But that's not the way the world is, right? It's deeply mysterious. It's deeply sacred is the proper word. It's a gift from God. It's creature. It's created. And that's part of the project, I think, which was interesting in writing the book, was that I realized that we needed to actually re-enchant ourselves as Christians, that we too, and this I talk about it in the language of we need to rebaptize the Christian imagination, but the idea is that we, this is the air we breathe. The modern intelligentsia tell us there's nothing beyond the world, and so we kind of have experienced the felt absence of God too, just like everybody else. And so this is a project I realize, somewhat surprisingly, has implications for our own spiritual journey and walk with the Lord and things like that.
Paul, you earlier said that we need to be involved in this project of re-enchantment. It's not just about the world, but it's about ourselves. It's about the church even, right? And, it brings to mind an idea that I wanted to get you to respond to. A lot of Christian thinkers over the years have talked about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the relationship between those three. Often in sort of a modernist age, you could say, we really focus a lot more on propositional truth, right. What is true, what is false, sort of a rationalist, right. Materialist sort of understanding, but we ignore the good and the beautiful. It sounds to me what you're saying is that we've done that to our detriment, and if we want the gospel, if we're, again, following this project of cultural apologetics, if we're wanting the gospel, the truth of the gospel to seem plausible in our culture, we've got to focus at least as much on the good and the beautiful as we do on the true. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this was, again, one of the surprises as I began to read and think and wrestle with this question. And really this question, prior to becoming a professor, I was a campus minister for 16 years on the college campus. And the question I wrestled with there was, how does the gospel get a fair hearing? And I was trained as a traditional apologist, and I'm a philosopher, so I love arguments. I love propositions. I love putting them together in syllogisms and things like that. But what I realized is that, and actually Peter Kreeft, who is a philosopher, was very helpful in this, and this was something that sort of brought some things together for me, where he talks about in one of his books, he basically says that God has given us three prophets of the human soul. And the prophets are reason, which is on a quest for truth, and then our conscience, which is on a quest for goodness, and then our imagination, which is on a quest for beauty. And then, if we put our theology caps on and ask the question, well, what is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? Well, the answer is Christ. And in fact, I love how St. Augustine, who wrote a book called The Confessions, which is a story of his own journey to Christ, an early church father, he said this about Jesus, though. He said, "You are the beauty of all beautiful things and the good of all good things." And then I would just add the truth in which all true things point. And so that idea that was unpacked in Augustine and then Peter Kreeft and others, actually, it's all over now that I have eyes to see, is so important, because the objections to the gospel aren't just objections against the reasonableness of the gospel, especially today. There's questions about the beauty of the church or the hypocrisy of Christians, or, is the God of the Old Testament a moral monster, or things like that. They call into question whether Christianity is actually good for the world. So one of the things I realized is that, number one, there's more objections to the faith than merely, believing God is irrational, as the atheists would want to claim. There's also these objections that are aimed towards the goodness and the beauty as well. And so I do think a full-orbed apologetic would address all of those. And of course, those are tightly related because they find their source in Christ. And, the longing of our heart, I know that you talk about story a lot, the deep longing of our heart is for a story that understands us, a story that is true to the way the world is, but also true to the way the world ought to be. And so the claim in the book, is not a new one, is that Christianity is that story. It's, the story of the world, and it's the story that satisfies all the deep longings of our heart.
Well, I wanted to stick mostly to cultural apologetics, but you've got another book that is out this year called The Story of the Cosmos. And in some ways, we're sort of transitioning into the ideas that are found there, right? I mean, yes. The idea that a worldview is a story of reality.
Right.
And that we like the Christian worldview not because we like it, but because, or I should say, we believe in the Christian worldview, not merely because we like it, but because we think it is the truest story of the world. Is that, again, some of what you're trying to get at here?
Yeah, absolutely. So truth matters. I mean, of course, our life, we need to be rightly related to reality. So truth is a high value. It's a deep longing of the human heart. And so I wouldn't want anybody to think, when we talk about goodness and beauty, that it's a neglection of truth. Any cultural apologetic, any apologetic worth its salt has to argue for the truth of their view, right? My proposal is that it's more, though. It's so much more, and that's the beauty of the gospel story, is that it's true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be.
Yeah. There's another important figure in your thinking and in your works that I'd like you to say a bit about and how he relates to the ideas that we've been talking about, and that is Charles Taylor. He wrote a book in particular, I believe it was about 12 or 14 years ago, 2007, if I'm remembering right, called A Secular Age. He talked a good deal about this idea of disenchantment in that book. Can you say more about him and how he informed your thinking?
Yeah, I think Charles Taylor is a really important philosopher so that book you mentioned is 900 pages, so it's not for the light of hearts. Thankfully, though, Jamie K. A. Smith, who teaches at Calvin, did write a commentary, you might even say, or just a primer or a summary of Taylor's work, and I find that really helpful too. That's called How Not to Be Secular, I think is the name. But yeah, Charles Taylor is really important because I think he has his sort of finger on the pulse of what's been happening in the world. And he begins, the thing that's so striking about his work is he basically begins and says, imagine that you were a person that existed 500 years ago. Pretty much everyone 500 years ago, right around the Reformation era, believed these three things. They believed that the kingdoms of this world were rooted in reflections of the kingdom of God, number one. Number two, they believed that this world functions, the word is semiotic, but it's just that this world functions as a sign or it points us to the divine. And then third, that the world was enchanted. There's that world again, this sacramental view of the world. And the more that I've studied this, and this is actually part of the sort of future projects that I'm working on, are recapturing a lot of what was lost in the last 500 years as we sort of pick up with the Reformation and then work our way through the Enlightenment. A lot of those views sort of were one by one replaced with more reductionistic views and materialistic views and things like that, where the world was emptied of all that beauty. So yeah, Charles Taylor I think is really helpful for someone, especially who wants to understand the deep contours of what's happening in culture. Again, not for the faint at heart, but it's a great work.
Well, it seems to me that one of the implications of Charles Taylor and one of the implications of what you're saying is that we can believe in the propositional truth, or let me say it another way, we can give intellectual assent to the propositional truth of the gospel, but the story we are living in and living out is so antithetical to the gospel that we are, for all practical purposes, atheists, even though we might affirm the ancient creeds.
Yeah, and actually I'm glad you brought that up because this is the other big insight from Taylor. He talks about the word that he uses is social imaginaries, but it's just the idea that the story, the worldview that we live is something that sort of seeps into our bones and it functions at the level of our imagination. And so what I like about Taylor, and other thinkers more recently have been pointing this out too, is that it's not just our minds, it is our minds, but we're so much more than that, right? We have imagination, we're desiring animals, we're narratival animals, we're moral animals, and all of that works together and seeps sort of, as they put it, into our bones, and that's where we betray, I think, what we really believe. And so that's why this project of rebaptizing the imagination, which I actually argue is something, I break out some of the barriers to the gospel. Some are internal, in other words, things that we need to get clear as Christians. Some are external, so those would be objections out there. But one of the key internal barriers that I argue about in the book is that we, as the church and as believers in Christ, need to rebaptize our imagination and actually care about our imagination, because that's where a lot of the disconnect happens between that propositional assent that you mentioned and the way that we actually live.
It seems to me, too, that what you're saying here, Paul, in part at least, explains why when someone comes along who affirms Christian truth but also pays a lot of attention to the imagination, that we just become infatuated by it. I think of C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, and not just them, they're probably the most prominent, though, that we just almost instantly realize that there's something very, very special and different about them on the one hand, and on the other hand, when we ignore that as a church, other things fill up to replace it, come up to replace it. I think of, Hunger Games and a lot of the dystopian literature that has popped up in the last 30 or 40 years. Shows like Stranger Things on Netflix, which have the sort of this sort of mundane material 80s world of shopping malls and, whatever it might be, but also this sort of mysterious world as well. Our mind, our heart, our souls long for that in such a way so that when we're deprived of it, we look for it in strange places.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting observation because, again, the intelligentsia of the world say, there is no God, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's nothing beyond this material cosmos. But then you look at the things that we watch and the shows that we're driven to. And culture is fascinated with the occult, the paranormal. Stranger Things is a great example where there's something beyond the mundane. And then at some point, we might want to ask ourselves, why are we so fascinated with this? As we drill down into our hearts, what is it about us as humans that is drawn to these extra mundane things? And I think that's actually quite telling, that our hearts portray what the intelligentsia are telling us. And so part of our project, I think, as Christians, is to connect these two realms. And part of the worry, actually, is you can have a lot of false re-enchantment that's happening here, where we long for something. Everybody, I think, as we think theologically, everyone, the deepest desire of our heart is God. As Augustine said, our hearts are restless until we find our rest in God. So we know that, sort of anthropologically as humans, we know that. But when we're not aware of that deep longing of the heart, and then but yet we still long for these things, what I see in culture is that we're fascinated with all these things that aren't necessarily going to re-enchant us in the way that are going to lead us to the true God. And so we can use these things, but we also need to be careful that we don't settle with them. And so I would encourage all of us as cultural apologists to push through it. What is it about Stranger Things? What is it about the paranormal or zombies or the little magical creatures on your phones when you play that game that everybody was interested in a few years ago, Pokemon Go? Why are we looking for augmented realities and virtual realities? What is it? And so our job is to press through that to the actual longing that's driving that, which is our longing for God.
Shane Morris here again. If you're enjoying this conversation with Paul Gould, I've got an offer I think you're going to like. Paul Gould is one of the teachers for the Colson Center's next online short course. It's called How Not to Be a Secularist, and it also includes two other great Christian thinkers, Anthony Easelin and Peter Leithart. The course takes place on 4 consecutive Tuesday nights, beginning October 1st. You can find out more about this short course by going to breakpoint.org and clicking on the Events tab at the top of the page. Now, let's get back to Warren Cole-Smith's conversation with Paul Gould.
Paul, it seems to me that some of the ideas that you're talking about, other people in the church are starting to think about as well. You've mentioned James K.A. Smith, for example, Jamie Smith. Not only has he been writing about these, but now he just took over the editorship of Image magazine, which is concerned with poetry and fiction and creativity and ideas. A friend of the Colson Center and World Magazine, and a personal friend of mine is a guy named Andrew Peterson, who is a great musician, but also someone who's written novels, fantasy novels, and he's got a book coming out in the fall about creativity and the imagination. I guess my point is that this stuff is starting to show up here, even within the church. That's got to be encouraging to someone like you who's been talking about these ideas for many years.
Yeah, it is very encouraging. Actually, I think that I don't want to say yet that there's a renaissance or rebirth in the Christian imagination, but I see some really encouraging trends. I think the people that you mentioned, Andrew Peterson and the Rabbit Room, and the things that they're doing, even here, as we're talking, we're in Colorado Springs, and they've got the Anselm Society that's trying to re-enchant the church through the arts. You have these incredible theologians like Malcolm Guite over in the UK, and I'm thinking of Jeremy Begbie here in the States at Duke Divinity School, who are poets and theologians, or musicians and theologians, that are teaching us how to do theology through the arts. My wife actually is in a master's degree at Dallas Theological Seminary right now, where it's an art and theology degree. It's a master's in worship arts, but it's basically for artists and people that are interested in spoken word poetry or film or writing, which is what my wife is there for, or painting. And so, yeah, I'm really encouraged, and I think that the time is right. I think that we are so disenchanted, especially as Protestants and evangelicals. I think historically Catholics, Orthodox tend to have a more sacramental view of the world as it is. But the world that I live in as a Protestant, though, I think that we're just we're very disenchanted, but yet God is here, right? And God is faithful, and God is working. And so, yeah, I'm super encouraged by some of these things, and I do hope that it would be a renaissance in Christian thought in this and art in this area.
Well, I'm going to push on that just a little bit more and ask for your advice. You and I are both here speaking at Summit. We're speaking about different topics, but complementary topics. One of the things that I talk about is the power of story and the power of media to shape our worldview. And I will usually begin my conversation with these kids by asking them, how many of you think you might want to be a painter, a musician, an artist, a designer in your life? And I'll get maybe 20 or 30% of the people to raise their hand, which I think is great, by the way. They have that many. But then I ask another question. How many of you think you might ever read a book, might ever listen to a song, might ever watch a movie or a television show, might ever buy a couch that you hope looks good in your living room? Right. We are all consumers of the creative output of other people, even if God is maybe not calling us to a vocation of creativity. Got any word for the rest of us, for the church, the ones that may not be called to the, like I say, to the creative arts as a vocation, but are really resonating with what you're saying here and want to go deeper?
Yeah, I would actually say three things since you asked. Well, actually four. The first thing I would say is that it's really important, I think, for us just to say, it might sound obvious to many of us, many of your listeners, but I think we need to say it, that the church needs artists, and artists need the church. I think it's important that we just say that. I was just speaking to someone earlier this week who is an artist, and just to verbalize with her that this is a worthy vocation is something that's important to say because of some of the, there's a time in our history where we just didn't know what to do with beauty, with art, and so in many ways beauty was in exile and maybe is a little bit. But I'd say, go ahead.
Well, and I was just going to add to that. I think that's such a good word, Paul, because not only that, but artists, especially young artists, they're pushing boundaries. They're questioning. If art means anything, it means what is reality and how do I represent that in the craft that I'm trying to master? And you're going to get that wrong a lot. Right. And it's not going to be perfect ever, but it's not even going to be good most of the time. Right. And for the artist to have a community that holds truth at a high level, but also is okay with that messiness of getting it wrong, is really difficult. And I think that's why a lot of artists are driven out of the church. They go look for community elsewhere.
Right. Or we just don't know what to do with them. And we freak out or we worry, and instead of bringing them into community. And so part of the burden for me is that we would have a tight link between art and theology and art and the kingdom because they're related. Again, what is the source of all this, right? We own this as Christians because it's rooted in the triune God. And so we should be the ones creating the best art and doing telling the best story because we live as part of the best story. So real quickly, what I would want to say though to people as they're thinking about this, how can all of us, because I think in some way God, a creator God who creates and then cultivates goodness, truth, and beauty, we are created in the image of that God. And so in some sense, all of us are creators and cultivators of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so I would just say real quickly, number one, to work to reincorporate beauty into your life and everything that you do, whether it's making an omelet or a PowerPoint presentation or you're mowing your lawn or whatever it is, just work to incorporate it at one level. Secondly, though, and this is more in our relating with others, I would encourage us, and I'm thinking of how Jesus interacted through story and parable and metaphor and things like that, is to learn to engage in what I would call imaginative reasoning in our discussions, where we take reason and propositions, but we learn to communicate it in a way that's meaningful. And then the third thing that I would want to say, and again, this is just maybe something that needs to be said, the most beautiful thing that we can do, all of us, is to locate our life in the story of the gospel. This is the true story of the world. And when we do that, our lives will be beautiful and others will want to hear more. So that would be three quick things, or four.
Paul, I don't remember where I heard you say this, but I know I heard you say it. It might have been on the podcast, another podcast I was listening to that you were on, or it might have been in your book. Now I can't remember. But you said that one of the things that we need to do as Christians is to see and delight in the world the way Jesus did and the way Jesus does. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, this is part of the process, I think, of re-enchanting ourselves and joining with God and the Holy Spirit to re-enchant ourselves. If you think about, if you look at the Gospels and you look at the life of Christ and just more broadly the biblical worldview, it's a world that is God-bathed and God is everywhere present. It's not like God, there's space that's empty and things like that, but God is right here with us. If you could see I'm holding my hand right in my face, like this is where God is and this is the kind of world we have. And I think that we can't proclaim fully the beauty of the gospel until we have learned to see the world the way Jesus does and then to delight in it. And I'm always driven, as I think about this, to a quote that C.S. Lewis said in the book The Problem of Pain, but he's talking about divine goodness, and he says this. He says, look, God doesn't give the happiness there isn't. He gives the happiness there is. And, we only have three options at the end of the day. Actually, two. One option is we can be God, but none of us are God. So we have two options. We can either enjoy God in creaturely response, or we can eternally starve, right? This is the only options that we have as humans, and this is what happiness amounts to. And so, I think that the idea of seeing and delighting in the world is just this idea that the way that we view the world actually matters. And theologians today are talking about an idolatrous way of perceiving the world when we talk about disenchantment, because when we perceive the world through the disenchanted lens, what we do is we reduce the world and we reduce God to the level of human appetite. And then we're not actually being correctly related or interacting with the world that God has made.
Well, somewhat related to that is something else that you said that I want to maybe ask you to say a little bit more about here, and that is that the relationship between truth and beauty is I think you said, the aesthetic currency of our time. And in part, I think what you mean by that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that while the church has often been pretty good at proclaiming what is true, we do it in ways that are ugly and banal, and that prevents what we are saying, the truth of what we are saying, from being heard by the culture. Is that what you mean, or do you mean something more or different from that?
No, I think that's right on. The idea is that we're people of the book as Christians. We've been given the text of Scripture, yet we live and we find ourselves living in an age of image. And actually, the idea of the aesthetic currency of our time is a phrase that Jamie K. Smith said in some of his writings. And I think that that's right, that this is the thing, song, music, poetry, music, Netflix binges, whatever it is, these are the things that drive much of culture today. And so we need to be tapping into that and helping people understand what's going on in their human hearts, and then point them through much of it, which is quite good. But the things that are good about it, the stories that we are drawn to, or the music that we're drawn to, or the paintings that we're drawn to, the things that are quite good, I actually think are the things that connect to the gospel story. And so we need to be making those connections, and that's why we shouldn't run from, we have to have Christian wisdom, but we shouldn't run from the aesthetic currency, as he would say, of our time.
Finally, I just want to ask you about your own process. You've published 3 books this year so far, as you and I are talking. You got a 4th one coming out.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that either you have been extraordinarily busy, or that's a bit of an accident of the calendar of we've been working on these for years and they all just happen to be coming out this year, or maybe a little bit of both. Do you work every day on a book?
No, I don't work every day. I've been teaching a lot, actually, the last few years, but it is a little bit of both. I am very structured. I have my writing days, and when I do, that's what I start with first thing in the morning. When I have my teaching days or my prep days or my travel days, I'm always reading. So I'm either always reading and thinking and journaling and contemplating, or I'm writing. And so if you add that up over time, I'm a pretty structured person, so if you add that up over time, eventually you seem to get some things done on the writing end. Yeah.
Well, no, I've heard writers say, writing 70,000 words is hard, but writing 250 words a day for a year is pretty easy, and you get to 70,000 words at the end of a year.
Yep.
So I kind of get all that. Again, if I could just drill down a little bit more into your process. When you write mostly or maybe exclusively nonfiction. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Do you do any fiction or poetry on the side that you're not?
Not really. I have tried some spoken word poetry, but I'm not going to claim that at this point.
Well, so on the nonfiction side, which you mostly do, you outline? Do you kind of have a central idea? What's your process there?
Okay, good. Let me think here a little bit about it. I do outline. I draft outlines, and I keep a big picture. And then I will have a writing goal for the day. I am like that. I'll usually shoot to write a section of some outline, and then as I write that out, that section, things morph all the time, and so I'm always tweaking. So it's just a process of a dialectic of going back and forth. Write, and then read something, and something spurs an idea, and then I write in a different direction, and the outline changes. But right now I've got 3 books outlined, ready to go, just needing the time to sit down and do that writing. So always thinking, always preparing.
Well, some of our listeners might be aspiring writers. Got any advice for them?
I would just say, start where you are and write your first draft. Actually, I do have, my friends think that I tend to edit. So some people write a rough draft that's really, really rough, and then they have to go back time and time again. My process is a little different. So my friends think I'm a better writer than I am, because the way that I do it, though, is I tend to go pretty slow for those 500 words that I work on, but I edit as I go. And so I'm not just trying to get it all out. I'm trying to get it out as good as I can. And so I will sometimes spend a long time on a paragraph. But when it's done, well, then I'm done. And so those 500 words are good, and then I can move on. And so that's my process. Other people, I think, will write rough drafts, and then they're continuing to go back and back and back. But I tend to just have a fairly clean draft by the end of the day of whatever that section was that I'm working on.
But it sounds like what I'm hearing between the lines here is there's no substitute for sitting your fanny in the chair and just making sure you get it done every day, or at least a few times a week.
Yeah, and sometimes the writing that you do will never see the light of day. You know, you scrap things. Sometimes I've found myself writing a lot of blogs for different people, and that is actually really good practice. Even if nobody reads it, it's taught me the discipline of writing. Because for me, the thing that drives me isn't the process. I know some people, actually not all writers enjoy the process. I enjoy the end product. That's the thing that's highly motivating to me. The process is a discipline, and it's something that I don't feel like doing often in the morning, but as a goal-oriented person, that's what the end product is what drives me more than the process of it.
Yeah. Well, Paul, the end product, at least the ones that I've read, have been outstanding. Thank you. I'm really especially grateful for Cultural Apologetics. That book is one that I believe will stand the test of time, and I'm grateful to you for that book, and thanks for being on the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was Paul Gould discussing his new book, Cultural Apologetics, with the Colson Center's Warren Cole Smith. If you'd like to hear more from Paul Gould, consider signing up for the Colson Center's upcoming online short course, How Not to Be a Secularist. Paul will be one of the featured speakers in this course. It begins October 1st, and you can find out more by going to breakpoint.org and clicking on the Events tab at the top of the page. Before we go, I'd like to remind you that the Colson Center is offering the latest book from Os Guinness as our featured resource for the month. Oz is one of the leading Christian thinkers of our time, and he's been a great friend to the Colson Center for many years. That's why we're delighted to offer to you his new book, which is called Carpe Diem Redeemed, Seizing the Day, Discerning the Times. Os Guinness explains what it means to be fully human, fully alive, and fully engaged in the culture. You can get Os Guinness's new book by going to breakpoint.org and making a donation of any size to Breakpoint and the Colson Center. Again, that's breakpoint.org. Finally, be sure to join us on Wednesday for Part 6 of our special series by Britt Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson, entitled Doing the Right Thing, an exploration of ethics. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.